Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be doing my spoiler-filled review for Ghost Story by Jim Butcher. This is very different from any of the other reviews that I have done. If you've been following along with the channel and you watch my typical book reviews, I usually like to break things up in terms of plot and character and writing and world building and then kind of an overall impression of the books. But in a series like Dresden, where we are now up into the teens, I don't feel like that format is going to be very helpful or very useful. So what I want to talk about is just what I feel the purpose of Ghost Story was, if I thought that it worked or didn't work as the installation in Dresden that immediately follows changes. I'm going to talk about some of the character development that happened and just about some of my general thoughts about the book at large. This is a book that I think is always going to suffer for being the book that follows changes, which is the book that almost everyone, it is almost unanimous that people feel like Changes is, if not their favorite book in Dresden Files, that book that has the most impact, that really signals a turning point in the series, and is just a really hard book to top. And I think that being a new fan of Dresden, someone who is coming into the series as we are at book 17, there are books that have been published post Ghost Story, someone who does not have to wait, who did not spend a year waiting after Changes to get another book. That means that my perspective on it is probably going to be a little bit different than someone who followed the series as the books were being published, who had to reach that conclusion of Changes and wait. I don't even know if it was a year. I don't know if it was longer. A year is typical, but had to wait some extended period of time to figure out what happened and then, be given the book that you were given. So I think that probably how you react to this book is going to depend on what you like in stories, like what you are looking for when you go into a book, and also at what point in the kind of publication history of Dresden you happen to come upon Ghost Story. After having finished this book, I will say that it may not be a perfect book. I don't think that Ghost Story is not my favorite of the Dresden Files books, and if I'm trying to be as objective as I can, which true objectivity is a very difficult state to attain, especially in terms of evaluating something like a novel, but I don't think that it is the best Dresden Files book, but I think that it is the perfect follow-up to Changes. And I think that it is absolutely the book that was needed after everything that happened in Changes. And as I said, my perspective comes as somebody who did not spend a huge amount of time waiting for this and who can now go on into the next book and figure out some of the things that I have been looking forward to seeing and seeing how Harry adjusts and reacts to some really big changes in his life that happened in Changes. So I'm just going to say that. I appreciate where my perspective is coming from. But Ghost Story, which is a literal and in the proverbial sense, a ghost story, it's really a book of introspection. So it's following Harry's reaction, the way that he allows himself to mentally and spiritually process the events that happened in Changes. And much like any ghost stories that we are given, if we think about A Christmas Carol, if we think about the way that ghosts are portrayed in the Dresden Files and in other works of fantasy and other works of popular fiction, ghosts are often depicted as remnants of what's left over, what remains of a person. And usually there is some feeling that the reason that they come into being is because there is something that has been unfulfilled. There's something lingering. Ghosts are not often depicted as a state of being that is healthy, of a state of being that is the natural order of things. And that is kind of outside any sort of spiritual considerations, any considerations of faith. The way that ghosts are depicted, and especially the way that they have been depicted in the Dresden Files so far, is that there is a sense of unfulfilled potential. And the story that we are given in this novel is that we have Harry's spirit. And Harry himself is unsure why he has been selected, why he has been given this opportunity to return to the world to try to figure out who was behind his murder. And why I think this works so well is because there were such a huge series of incredibly traumatic and incredibly monumental changes that happened to Harry. I hate saying changes and then having to say the name changes because it sounds so silly. Curse you, Jim Butcher, for giving that book such an apt title. But Harry has to deal with the repercussions of what happened in Changes. And there's a lot for him to process. And I can understand why people would have wanted to see him process that as Harry Dresden, human being. But I think, personally, based on Harry's personality, which is this very self-deprecating, internally harsh person, I think that it would have been very difficult for him to work through what he needed to work through if he were thrust back into his human life in order to deal with the consequences of the things that have happened. We are talking about a man who, in the span of a couple of days in Changes, went from being someone who really valued the sanctity of human life to being someone who had to take a human life on multiple occasions, who had to, in cold blood, murder someone to achieve the power that he felt was necessary to do what he needed to do, and being someone who is not at all motivated by power, to have to do something that goes so against your nature in order to obtain something that you, in normal circumstances, would not even want, would be a huge psychic rupture for Harry. And then obviously the incredible emotional trauma of having to end Susan's life at the end of Changes. Those would be two things that would be incredibly difficult for Harry to work through. And I think, given the rest of the fallout from the end of Changes, from Molly's injury to having to find safe haven for his daughter, just the lifestyle changes, the loss of his staff, the loss of his car, the loss of his home. There are so many things that happen in Harry's life that I think it would have been really difficult for us to appreciate, or for Harry in order to come to terms with these things happening, if he had been kind of thrust into his life. Because we know Harry, he is a danger magnet. He had signed himself up to be the Winter Knight, so it's not like Mab was going to take things easy on him and say, oh yes, Harry, take your rest day. What you need to do is recharge. Self-care is important. I don't think any of those things would have been at the top of the list. So I think that had Harry had to go directly back into his everyday life, we would have seen him fumbling, and I think that it would have been much more likely that he would have lost himself. So I think that he needed this pause, and whether the powers that be, however you want to interpret what happened in this book, why Harry was given this chance, I think that it is something that was needed. And I think that Jim Butcher has been very purposeful in his handling of Harry as a character. I think that he has crafted a character that he clearly understands, that he has given an entire backstory, personality. He has made him one of the most vibrant, realistic, lifelike characters in fantasy. And I think that he understood what Harry needed. And I imagine that it may have been stressful for him to put out a book like this in such quick succession, right after Changes, right after one of the most epic, action-packed Dresden novels that he had written. To put out a book like Ghost Story right afterward, I think is a really courageous move. And from the very little that I have heard, because I have really been trying to avoid spoilers of any kind for this series, but from what little I have heard, it does seem to be a somewhat divisive book in the series. So I can see that maybe it didn't land for all of the fans in the way that it did for me. But I think that having this kind of specter of Harry go through his life and see the impacts that he has had, and see how his choices have kind of reverberated out into the world, I think that was a really important next step for him. And what this book's purpose is, and what Harry is trying to achieve, is to recognize that in making certain choices, he has not lost his true self. So really what this book is a journey of self-discovery for Harry. And I think that because so much of what Harry does is reactionary, in every book, Harry is put under immense pressure. He has to solve a mystery. He has to save his friends. He has to come up with a spell. He has to do something. And he never has to think about what he has done. He just has to react. And because Harry has a good heart, underneath everything, underneath the bravado, underneath the leering, underneath the self-deprecation, Harry is a good person. And the way that Jim Butcher has brought this through to us is through his relationships with other people, the way that he treats people, the sacrifices that he has made, despite the self-loathing that is apparent in Harry and that he has grappled with throughout this entire series. He's genuinely a good person. He has a good heart. And I think that he needed this time to discover that the choices that he made in Changes do not negate the fact that he has spent an entire lifetime battling against the forces of evil. And I even wrote down a quote that this was my favorite part of the book. It, I think, sums up the purpose of Ghost Story perfectly. And that this happens when he is fighting Evil Bob. And we'll talk about Evil Bob in a second. But he says, "But he had reminded me, I did remember, I spent my lifetime fighting the darkness without becoming the darkness. Maybe I had faltered at the very end. Maybe I had finally come up against something that made me cross the line. But even then, I hadn't turned into a degenerate freakazoid of the Kemmler variety. One mistake at the end of my life couldn't erase all the times I had stood unmoved at the edge of the abyss and made remarks at its expense. They could kill me, but they couldn't have me. I was my own." And you don't really understand how hard this quote hits until you reach the end of the novel and you find out what was actually behind Harry's death, and you find out what actually led to that event occurring. So the resonance that this quote has, when I read it, it really resonated with me. When I finished the book and I went back and reread it, I was like, wow, Harry didn't believe that to the end of his life. He made a contingency plan to end his own life because he didn't trust himself. He didn't believe in himself enough to think that he could fight back against Mab, to fight back against her control. His fear, and this is something I talked about in my Changes vlog, his fear has always been losing himself. And for him to have this epiphany when fighting against Evil Bob, which I thought was like a fitting parallel, because we have Bob, who is this spirit that was sentenced to death by the White Council, that Harry took pity on, tried to understand, made a part of his life, who has been split into two entities, Good Bob and Evil Bob. For Harry to have this epiphany while fighting against Evil Bob, I thought that made the moment even better. I thought that it was even more impactful, but it has been a long journey for Harry. It has been a lifetime for Harry, trying to reconcile the fact that he has been put in impossible situations and has had to make really tough choices. And that doesn't mean that he is a bad person. You can do a bad thing insofar as there is kind of an objective good and bad. You can do negative things and not be a bad person. And I think that that's something that Harry really needed to discover. And that, I think, was the purpose of this entire book. And it took a lot of time. It took a lot of looking in at the other people in his life, people for whom Harry has much more empathy than he has for himself. When he looks at Murphy, when he looks at Molly, when he looks at the choices that they have made and the ways that the world has hardened them over the past 6 months, Harry's thought is not, they are now bad people. His thought is, in like typical Harry fashion, I did this to them. They're doing the best that they can with the damage that I inflicted. So he's taking that responsibility onto himself, as he always does. And he has so much more understanding for them and where they are in their lives. And he did not afford that understanding to himself. So I thought that having Ghost Story, a book where we could watch him reflect on his life and reflect on his choices and come to that realization, it was wonderful. I really, really enjoyed that book for this reason. And you can't really talk about how Harry comes to that realization without kind of touching base on the characters that he finds here. So I think that's really interesting. This book was long, and as I was reading through it initially, I thought, like, does all of this need to be here? Like, Jim Butcher, what is this? You just followed up this completely action-packed thrill ride of Changes. And I'm happy that you've given us this more introspective book, but it doesn't need all of these details. Doesn't need flashbacks to Harry's life as a young wizard. Doesn't need recaps of his relationships with all of his friends, partners, family members. Do we need all of these details? And by the end of the book, I was happy to say, yes, I think that we did need those things. I think that in seeing Harry's past, we get even more insight into how he became the person that he is. I think that in reflecting on his past and seeing that very real world representation of his life through Fitz, and some of the choices that he feels that he has been forced to make, Harry could make small strides in starting to forgive himself for some of his choices. When Harry sees Fitz, this young boy who feels like he has to protect those around him, who has objectively done something that is contrary to the laws of the mortal world and also morally not a nice thing to do. The hit that he tried to put out on Murphy and that crew led to the death of one person and the critical condition of another. So his actions had consequences, and Harry has nothing but empathy for him. He feels that Fitz is a victim of circumstance, and he does not afford himself that same leniency. And Harry always has a reason. He always thinks, well, like, I should have known better. I had command of magic. I had this. I had that. And he never and has not so far in this series afforded himself that same level of forgiveness. So I think that seeing how terrified he was when Justin tried to entrap him, seeing how betrayed he felt by Elaine when those events occurred, and then kind of getting that juxtaposition between him and Fitz, I think allows Harry, even if it's on a subconscious level, to recognize, like, I am also a victim of my circumstance. And then obviously through his friends and family and through the state of Chicago, I think that Harry gets a look into what he has done for the city. And I really liked the interaction between him and Leah. And I also really liked the interaction between him and the spirit in the graveyard, where the spirit calls him a monster. Because at the beginning of this story, and I think that this was why the scene was really important, I think Harry does regard himself as a monster. I think that he has done monstrous things, and so he has interpreted that as him being a monster. And we can't understand just how monstrous Harry thinks he is until we discover the plot to end his own life at the end of the book. And that makes everything that we read before, everything in retrospect, it hits even a little bit harder. But I think that Harry does believe that he is a monster. He looks around at how the town has fallen. He looks at all of the sacrifices that his friends have had to make, and he believes that those are his fault. But I think by the end of the book, even if he still carries the weight of some responsibility, which I think is probably warranted, Harry did make some bad choices in changes. He did depend on his friends in a way that he had been reluctant to do up to that point, but it was in the pursuit of something good. And I think that he had the best of intentions. And I think that he's able to make that distinction, even though he knows that he's going to have to deal with the repercussions of that. And at the end, when he is ready to go into the beyond, I think that he has finally reconciled that fact, and he is ready to accept the consequences and also recognize, what pushed him onto that path. So I think that that is really important. And I think that it makes those conversations with the spirit and that kind of grappling with what makes a monster really interesting in retrospect. I really enjoyed getting the look at Murphy and Molly in particular in this book. I think I could have predicted what was going to happen with Murphy, because at the beginning of the series, Murphy is a character that has to grow on you. I would be really surprised to find out that people loved Murphy instantaneously, because in those first 3 books, at the beginning of her relationship with Dresden, when they are not the friends, the partners that they are at this point in the series, we see a very prickly Murphy. She's very confrontational. She's very defensive. She's very suspicious. She doesn't trust anybody. She feels that Dresden is holding, this wall up between them, which he is, but it is for good reason. And I think that I could have predicted that with Harry's death, with the fallout from what happened in the previous books, that she would have this kind of backslide. I think Murphy is also someone who takes a lot of personal responsibility, who feels a lot of guilt for the actions that play out. She feels a lot of guilt for what happened to Harry. And I think that she takes that role to kind of serve and protect very seriously. And so I think that she would have had real difficulty grappling with his loss. And so it was heartbreaking to see her the way that she was. But this kind of efficient, cold, closed off, defensive, prickly Murphy is something that I could have seen. I think that she is doing the best that she can. I would like to know, and maybe this is something that exists in the world of extended like short stories or something. I would like to know just how deep her suspicions of Kincaid ran. Like, how did she approach that? Was it, as Dresden describes in this book, did she put up kind of a mental wall because she couldn't, like, there was such cognitive dissonance within her that she could not reconcile the fact that someone she had had a relationship with was the person who ended Harry's life? I would like to know how she feels about that and how that came to be, but I think that that's an interesting kind of wrench that gets thrown in here as well. Molly, like between these two books, I did think about like what would happen to Molly, but I think because I was so caught up in, you know, who's going to shelter her, who's going to take her into their care, I had kind of assumed that she was going to go be with Ebenezer, and that when we saw her next, she was going to be living with him, that there was going to be kind of that continuation. And what we got, I was not prepared for. I think that maybe I should have been, because we know that Molly has always grappled with her own inner demons, with that darkness, that potential that she has inside her. I was not expecting Leah to be the person to kind of jump in and take over her education and be the person to watch over her. And I was not expecting anything like the rag lady. But I think that, again, this was really interesting insight, watching Molly try to hold herself together and keep all the pieces together. And also the way that she interacts with the rest of the group. It feels very strange and stilted, which then makes total sense at the end of the book when you find out the role that Molly played, what she did for Harry and with Harry and to Harry. It really explains everything that comes afterward. And I thought that made that characterization and that descent really interesting. And I think that it made it all the more profound in retrospect. Speaking of Molly, the scene of the psychic battle between her and the corpse taker, where we have like the Star Trek parody and then also her mind palace, was phenomenal. I love Molly. I have enjoyed her ever since she came into the series, and I enjoy her more and more with every book. I thought that was probably my favorite part of the book overall. I also really liked fighting against Evil Bob and his fortifications as Harry went into the Never Never, but that psychic battle with Molly and the corpse taker, the fact that she can even attempt to take on such a long-lived primordial power, I think just completely shows off what level of badassery she has achieved. And it goes to show how far she's willing to go for her friends, for Harry, and the fact that she had this kind of contingency plan in place where she is willing to sacrifice herself, her essence, her spirit in order to keep everybody else safe. I mean, Molly's a carpenter, so at her core, you know that she has to be good people, but I love her so much, and I am so looking forward to seeing what happens to her in the rest of the series. I did like all of the other characters who kind of made a show in here. I liked getting to see more of Molly's brother. I thought that it was really interesting how Dresden's perspective on Mort changed, and that was a fun throwback to earlier books, and again shows some of that character development for Harry. I think that because he is so powerful, Harry often doesn't recognize what an impact he makes on other people. And I think that, like any of us, Harry is prone to snap judgments sometimes. And I really liked getting to see him come around to a character that he had judged poorly in the past and recognize the good in people. And it just fits into that overall theme of people not being exactly what they seem and having hidden depths, and seeing Mort get to rise up and use his powers and kind of come out the hero in the end was just like a good feeling. I always love Butters, so that, all of his parts were really good. Though I do have to admit that I felt really sad. I felt sad about Bob and Butters being a duo. I thought that it was great. I think that their intellects blend very well and that he is a good keeper for Bob. And I really have to commend Jim Butcher on his storytelling in this regard, because I had thought as I was reading through, like, Bob doesn't feel the same. Like, it seems like he's a little bit different. And then when we found out that he does kind of take on the characteristics of the person that he is with, I thought that was brilliant. That was so good. I think that takes a really subtle hand. And while there's lots of things about Dresden that I really love, the technical proficiency of the writing has never been one of the things that has stood out to me. But I thought Jim Butcher did a great job with this, and I was really, really impressed. So really enjoyed that little detail that he threw in there. Otherwise, I think those are all of like the big character things that I wanted to touch on. Like I said, favorite moments of this book included the fight in the Never Never, where Evil Bob has set up his kind of Saving Private Ryan World War II horror-scape that Harry has to kind of barge his way through. I loved the Battle of the Minds at the end of the book between Molly and the Corpse Taker. I really loved seeing his daughter with the Carpenters. Since he found his daughter and decided that he wanted somewhere safe to put her, that was my automatic reaction, is why is Michael's family not taking her? And then I thought, oh, maybe it's because he's too close. He wouldn't be able to maintain distance. It would be more dangerous for her. So I'm really glad to see that that is where she ended up in the end, because I don't know what Jim Butcher is going to do from here. And I don't know if Harry is going to be a part of her life, but obviously that will be much easier when she is living with the Carpenters. And just Uriel saying to Harry, like, you've done so much for his family. Why wouldn't he take care of your family? Like, what a moment. So good. And then obviously the big reveal at the end that Harry was the person who ended his own life was just, it made this book come perfectly full circle. I think that it really followed through on the themes of Ghost Story. I did not predict this happening. I did not have any clue that this is what it was going to be. I had assumed it was going to be some sort of higher power. I had even thought that it was going to be, is it He Who Walks Behind? I thought it was going to be that shadow who was coming back and potentially had some hand in it. Maybe Nicodemus, once he figured out that he couldn't win Harry over to his side, maybe he felt like he was going to be too strong a power on the opposite end. So I was not expecting this, did not see it coming. I felt fairly certain that Kincaid was the person who had killed him, even back in the last book, because it was too close to what they had talked about before, but I did not know it was going to turn out like that. And oh my gosh, I can't believe I almost forgot. Thomas, the whole time I was reading. So initially I was like, oh, Jim Butcher's not giving Thomas his due. Like, why have we not heard anything about Thomas? I'm so mad about it. And then once I came to the realization that Harry's memories became so much more vibrant once he was in contact with someone or was reminded of someone, I was like, oh, well, no one has brought up Thomas yet, and Thomas is not a part of this little Scooby Squad that they have set up. So this is why Thomas hasn't made his way into the story. But then to find out at the end that Harry couldn't think about Thomas because he was too guilty for the pain that he had put his brother through, and then seeing Thomas and how Thomas has reacted to Harry's death, because we did see a little bit of an erosion of Thomas's innate humanity over the last couple of books, ever since he was tortured and decided that he was kind of through with this grind, through with this fight. But to see him so affected by Harry's death was, Thomas is my favorite character, like not counting Harry, and it was so painful to see. But then obviously he got to live the good life at the end of his scene. So, no one can feel too sorry for Thomas with the way that his story ends in this book. But I was glad that Harry got to look in on him and see how he was doing, and that there did seem to be some hope on the horizon. But overall, like I said, I think this was exactly the book that was needed after Changes. I am glad that I can jump into the next book and find out exactly what is going to happen with Harry as Winter Knight. I think that because he understands what is happening, and because of Uriel's words, which I also wrote those down so that I could kind of re-reference them, where he says, lies, Mab cannot change who you are. Again, super important quote, ties into the themes very well and allows Harry to have that strength. It is not despair when he comes back into the world. He now knows, I signed up for this. I have to deal with the consequences of being the Winter Knight, but Mab doesn't own me. She doesn't change me. I made this choice and I will follow through on it, but I am still Harry Dresden. And what a powerful statement to end the book on. And like I said, I can jump into the next one and see what happens with the Winter Knight thing. So I can understand why people would have been disappointed by that, having then to wait another year or 2 years before they get a continuation of that storyline that had been playing on their minds. So I understand the frustration there. But overall, I thought that Ghost Story was a fantastic book. It was a very different Dresden book, but I think exactly the book that was needed at this time. And I am so looking forward to jumping into Cold Days. But I hope you enjoyed this. This is the first spoilery Dresden video that I have done. Please don't leave any spoilers for the remainder of the series if you do decide to give this a watch, and comment, but I would love to discuss anything about the series up to this point with you. And I will see you with another video soon. Bye!